Thank you very much, Jacques, for the introduction and the beautiful poem. It used to be an issue for me never to try and tackle philosophical issues in my poems, but I've long since outgrown that limitation. I'd like to thank everyone who's attending this Zoom meeting, wherever you are. I'd like to begin by placing myself. I'm now sitting in my study in Edinburgh's Port of Leith. This area was once had a reputation for drugs, prostitution, and the dedicated offal butcheries of Duke Street. But nowadays, Leith is very different, all cake shops and coffee bars, but it still treasures its rougher edges. The print behind me depicts a legendary generation of modern Scottish poets, from Hugh MacDiarmid to Edwin Morgan. When I first arrived in Edinburgh in 1980, all apart from MacDiarmid were still alive, walking the streets of Edinburgh. But since then, time has picked them off one by one, and now they're all gone, very much missed, I can assure you. It's been 20 years since I last faced an audience of my compatriots in a poetry reading. This has seemed to make the choice of a first poem unduly fraught. But in the end, I've decided to start by going back to my childhood years in Botswana in a poem with a Greek myth in it. I'm not a great lover of Greek mythology, but mainly on account of Rilke's great poem, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. The myth of Orpheus is one that constantly fascinates me, and I bring this myth to bear in my poem on the topic of dead trees. There was a lot of dead wood lying around in the Botswana of my childhood. Every few months or so, a truckload of dead trees would arrive in our yard and be piled up into a huge pyramid at the back of the house, ready to be chopped up into fuel for our wood-burning oven. My poem is called Dead Musical Trees. Trees were just left to die where they stood in Bechuanaland, their sucking systems finding less and less to draw from. Some, dead on their feet for years, revived to astound us. Others, like Rilke's Eurydice, were far too snuffed out to be called back from where they'd gone to. Their very natures had shifted within the table of elements, from the botanical to something almost metallic, an aluminium facsimile, dulled to its last mineral glimmer. And then, like sad, stiff violinists, they would scrape out works of high-friction, barbed wire orchestras. Harsh tones squealed from thorny instruments, the creaking windmill music of a rusty Orpheus. My next poem is about the pride that some poets have to be associated with a particular locality or region, which gives them a warm sense of belonging and identity. I've hidden away many such poets in this poem, but there's one I'd like to bring out of hiding. The phrase, the men of Assynt, alludes to the Scottish poet Norman MacCaig, who had a great affection for the region of Assynt in the northwest of Scotland, which he often wrote about. The poem is called Scrambling for Scotland. Someone was given the keys to Key West. Another has title deeds to the Little Karoo. This one speaks for the whole of Manhattan. That other got muck and egg on a plate. There's been a scramble to be crowned laureate of wheat belts and littoral zones. All the best ones have gone. There's just not enough good world to go around. Whole swathes of Siberia and Yorkshire, prime bits of Australia, most of Belfast, have been snaffled by wide-awake poets, sealing their bids with a sonnet sequence. All that's left is narrow spurs of land, a few tidal mudflats no one has grasped the potential of yet, geographic rejects insufficient to base a lasting reputation on. Most of us, late to the market, make do with these scraps of real estate, envious of the men of Assynt, the Shropshire lads who saw a bargain and moved in quick. I sing a weedy verge 20 minutes outside of Glenrothes on the A92, on the left-hand side as you travel north. That's my patch, so hands off, you losers. I came to Edinburgh in 1980 to do some postgraduate study in philosophy and ended up concentrating on the problem of non-existing objects. That was a long time ago, but I still have a fondness for writing about nothing, albeit lavishly decorated, which the next poem is an example of. It's called Impulse and Direction. Thorny herrings split the sea from shore to shore. Passages compelled by lodestones, tugging grains of magnetite in brains. Navigational charts run alongside the dorsal line from gill to rudder. Sea roots tattooed on the scaly skin. Bonework as light as a bird's, engraved with the signs of the zodiac, give their owners a head start on urchins, star, and jellyfish. Their spines and prickly hackles are laid back for amazing speed. I used to go in great fear of English grammar, which I blame on poor schooling. But nowadays I adore all aspects of language study, and I see language analogues in everything. Plant structures, human machines, animal bodies, solar systems. So the next poem is called Sea Languages. Sea languages are boneless, stiffened only with spurs of cartilage, sparingly interspersed. Their oil content is high to keep them from freezing solid in the blue champagne of polar waters. Spoken freely in the tropics, they drift southwards in a slow shift of vowels, following the sweep of the astrolabe. Some are carried overseas on the backs of coconuts and learn to climb trees. Many are spawned among coral reefs and archipelagos, never to be spoken, dying in sea purses and polyps before any animal organism has fitted them to vocal plates and mouth arrangements. Thousands of languages wash ashore in ocean surges, their broken consonants littering the beaches like empty crockery. Vast shoals of tongueless fish are left mute, gagging on linguistic incapacity. Never written down, sea languages have short attention spans. They contain no lasting records of nets, hooks, lobster pots. Every tide washes them out of memory. They dissolve into the ocean like salt. The only birds I come across in my daily life are pigeons, seagulls, and crows, which I'm quite fond of writing about. I would dearly love to write about yellowhammers and birds of paradise, but I'm stuck with the avian riffraff I see scuffling about in Leith. To clarify a little expression in the poem, a Ned in Scottish idiom is an uneducated, raucous, antisocial youth. Jailbird. That gull wing spreads the full span of my desk. Its body is all twigs and muscles and stiff fabric fans. Its sharp, cartilaginous mouth looks comical, but isn't. It's as brutal as a billhook. I've seen it maul pigeons in doorways with a murderous persistence unhindered by pity. Its plumage of chartered accountant fools no one. It's a rough bird, harbor thug, quayside brawler. Nesting ones have the vicious propensities of benefit-hardened clans protecting their neds. The voice is harsh for execrations and ululations. Screaming into flight, it chops sideways a lightweight body frame with not an ounce to spare on aeronautical bones, wings rigid as boomerangs. The story behind my next poem is a holiday romance between a man and a mermaid. Wanting to prolong the relationship, they first try him living with her. And when that doesn't work out, she decides to visit him in his human suburban home to discuss the possibility of her moving in with him. It's called Mermaid Indoors. The human had unsettled her. His breathing difficulties underwater, the puckering of his fingertips, stinging of his eyes, the raw fish diet that didn't agree with his stomach. Now she was sitting in his house, smelling like a shoreline that has been baked rancid in the low tide. The great flail of her tail fin curled awkwardly backwards out of sight. Her body spread the coldness of ice boxes or shipping containers. Elements of salt and ammonia composed her presence, the rank mephitic odor of a dying fish. Her gaze was fixed and ankylose, stiff cellulose, unblinking, bare, hardened by the eye-withering sharpness of ocean saltiness. Blue scales speckled the carpet. She spoke with the sadness of a sea animal, which has laboriously learnt the one-sided language of men, one incapable of addressing the alien, disfigured half of her. She spoke of dualities, natural and supernatural, middle class and beatnik, two circulations, one where the blood ran cold, mingling fish and mammal. She exclaimed her wonderment at soft, warm towels, humidifiers, and scented candles from John Lewis. But mostly she spoke of that world given up to satisfy her keen, occasional taste for men. Shoals of bonefish and barracuda, the perils of propeller injuries and dredge fishing, dark realms of maelstrom, wreck, and kraken. And she kept coming back to that bathroom of his, fragranced by rosemary and eucalyptus, with the curved slipper bath that was far too small to hold her. I'll skip the poem. Eating is a major theme of my writing. I've always struggled with the notion of food. I'm appalled by the necessity of having to put stuff into our bodies every few hours just to keep going. Some of that disgust is evident in my next poem, which is called Dog Dinners. Our ancestors started eating meat before their souls had progressed far enough to entertain scruples of fellow feeling. By the time such powers entered their delectable brains, it was too late. A lust for animal matter in all its forms had taken root and rooted deep. No good lamenting the extremer fringes of our appetites now. Frogs, cats, guinea pigs, horses, monkeys, other, beg pardon, human beings. The distinctions are academic once the eating begins. That chicken just fell off its bones. That was the freshest dog I've ever tasted. We live until we're eaten, chewed alive by crashed motor cars, or cooked slowly by ravenous, methodical diseases. One dog may be another dog's dinner. Let us compose fine melodious graces. Starch the tablecloths. Choose a light white wine to serve with the collie. Bon appétit. To get rid of the aftertaste of that poem, I have a small one called Cleansing the Palate. Which is this. Nothing with a face or a soul or any hope of an afterlife will be tossed into a stew pot at the behest of my recipes. No animal was frightened in the preparation of this meal, or even milked against its will. Cows who met a peaceful vegetarian end have not been looted sneakily for sausages. As proof of their free-range status, all the chickens on this farm, at least once in their lives, have been chased by foxes. I love to embody abstract systems in solid materials. And in my next poem, this process is accomplished with a knife, scissors, and glue. It describes the only occasion my vocal production has been cleaned up by the skills of a sound engineer. Sound engineer. Ums and ers, blurts and stutterings fall to the sound studio's cutting floor. A word surgeon is at work, healing my blemished, badly spoken sentences, removing gristly mishaps in my delivery. She runs the magnetic spool backwards and forwards to identify ugly glottal lumps in the vocal tissue, finds one, snips it out, and neatly closes the gap. A noisy swallow lies on the floor on 1 inch of tape. I listen in amazement as she isolates a sigh, removes and transfers this tiny puff, intact, into a different utterance. My phrases breathe more freely now, flowing through uncongested channels. She directs her art to linguistic particles, swapping morphemes and phonemes around like someone transplanting a cornea. She's a language beautician, improving my nasalizations and clipping my consonants. I end up speaking like an angel in a purified dialect of correct and impeccable sounds, while around her feet, on snippets of tape, inarticulate phonic fragments of my voice continue to gulp and hiss and croak. What this next poem really explores, in using idioms of transgression, is language as virtual reality. Being able to explore the world without having to put your boots and waterproofs on. It's called performative utterance, which was invented, the notion of performative utterance was invented by the Oxford philosopher J.L. Alston in his essay, How to Do Things with Words. It describes activities which cannot be performed without the use of language. Making promises is an example. The poem is called Performative Utterance, How to Do Things with Words. Language may lick where the tongue is disallowed. A lingual ambassador given leave to enter the locked Russia of another's life. Words doing the work of the hands and the insinuating voice. Phrases practice their surrogacy, load themselves with as much color, pollen, and suggestion as they can carry, and rub these into the perusing mind. Criminal acts of vocalization smuggle a delicious contraband of silk, vodka, and poetry hidden in the grunted underwiring of glottals. They give us the scratch of her suspenders, the very crackle of her nylons, so to speak. One of my favorite poems is Thomas Wyatt's wonderful elegy of regret. They flee from me that sometime did me seek. My poem is loosely based on Wyatt's, and from his poem I have directly quoted the lady's question, how like you this? Who sometime did me seek. You lost your taste for me. My mouth and tongue became unpalatable to you. My poor teeth and narrow lips no longer delectable to you. Yes, those very teeth, our mutual dentist despaired of ever needing his amalgams. Once, the muscular slug of your tongue, primed with salivary mucus, was not shy of our oral embraces. How like you this, you asked, and I liked it very much. In those days, my phonetic apparatus was your tongue's gymnasium, and your mouth nibbled my stubbly face for pleasure. Oh, why do you no longer love my crooked teeth, my spit, and my gums? About 50 years ago, I was a student member of the Rhodes University Creative Writing Society. I think Douglas Skinner may have dabbled in that occasionally as well. My first offering to them was a poem about love and the aging process. And I find I'm still exercised by this very topic. It so happened that the poet Sidney Clouts was present at that meeting, and he did not like my poem. Hopefully, this later incarnation will be an improvement. Love among the over 60s. Her body is full of unseen flaws, waiting to flourish in later life. Some propensities of the spine that will twist her like a harp, a faint prophetic flush of dyes under the skin that will become discolored, hard, and nodular over time, concealed by creams. Her psychology also will turn more bitter and concentrated, losing its winning ameliorations, foregrounding its harsher underlying tannins. And at just this time, we ourselves will lose our childish fear of imperfections. My next poem is a sort of riposte to the poet Robin Robertson for a poem which he published recently called near Glen Namfiad, a location in the Scottish Highlands. His poem is about the hunting and butchery of a stag in the Scottish Highlands. If you don't know of Robertson as a Scottish poet, and he's the very best, you may know him for his stunning and notorious Ovid translation, The Flaying of Marsyas, notable for its visceral realism and cruelty. Despite my squeamishness about these aspects of his poetry, I must emphasize that he's a poet I do go to again and again as an example of how to write brilliant and breathtaking poems. Mine, echoing his, is called Below Zgur na Lapaich, after Robin Robertson, near Glen Namfiad. The fallen stag lies at the extreme edge of weapon range, toppled by an arrow. Stretching from foreground tricklings to distances gripped in tight crowns of ice, a landscape has been shot through the eye. And in the center of this vast theater of fells, thrust plains, and erratics, laid open like a fruit wrenched in half, to display porphyry seeds, sweating their pink fluid, the competent butcher is crouching, transforming the animal into breakfast, lunch, and supper. And he is not alone, for beside him kneels the composing poet. He has butchery skills aplenty to equal the finest arts of his slaughtermaster. Half a dozen verbs for different snips, nicks, and easings with sounds to match, and enough words to mop up all the fluids. His voice follows the whispering knife, thinking aloud in slithers and sighs, turning the wet noises into English. The animal comes apart before us under the rapt lacerations of his language. Reluctantly, the final hoof is taken off, the deer broken down, the poet ecstatic. My second last poem is one of my religious poems, which is what I would call poems of theological skepticism, atheism, if you prefer. This poem imagines an act of incarnation, God taking over and occupying the body of a human being, a fascinating process to watch. Called In His Own Image. God wriggles into the full human bodysuit, pushes himself hard into the very ends of its feet, pulls the hands on tight, slips into its liver, permeates fat reserves with his divinity, then turns all the vital motors on and passes control to the brain. Now, all he has to do is wait for hunger pangs, the growth of fingernails, the first calls of nature, and that weird sensation of having to use simple muscle contractions in place of his old omnipotence. In my world, everything is reduced to and celebrated in physical materials. The greatest poverty is not to live in a physical world, to quote Wallace Stevens, or borrowing from Madonna, I'm a material boy. So my final poem takes up and plays with an idea in Yeats's poem, A Prayer for Old Age, the first stanza of which reads as follows. God guard me from those thoughts men think in the mind alone. He that sings a lasting song thinks in a marrow bone. So my poem is called Thinking in a Marrow Bone. It's a bit of an eccentric poem, but it's typical of the way I like to go about thinking and writing. Thinking in a marrow bone. Stiff old gelatine that has lost its wobble is ideal for thought. Steel inhibits. Slush cannot bind acts of steady contemplation. The human body has built soft and plausible cushions to enable the domestication of awareness, bringing life to the old dog yet. Consciousness creeps through yielding channels of breast, bone, and gristle until it finds a home substance to settle in. While software logic ponders in silicon and iron, deliberates in copper, our thoughts need comfy sponges to reach conclusions in, brainy brawn in which to make their feelings known. Thoughts running in a marrow bone have a congenial place to show some spirit or fiercely ratiocinate. Finding something to think in means avoiding the lonely ghostings of the Cartesian soul. Thought can snuggle into the clever legs of an octopus to grapple the world to itself, or to confer with lilacs, anemones, and stars. Thank you very much. That's my final poem.
If you'd like to unmute and give a round of applause to Basil. That was...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was a fantastic and very witty, very fluent reading. Thank you. I don't see what sound engineers would have to do at all.
Yes.
Are there any questions? Melissa, I don't know if you can see any hands.
Yet, other than your own.
Right.
Anyone who's got a question can either raise your hand on Zoom or ask it in the chat or let me know by waving. Otherwise, Jacques, you can start us off while others ponder.
Well, I'm going to have to formulate quickly, but I'm fascinated by that beautiful, amazing and savage image of the poet breaking down the materiality of the stag. I mean, one thinks of language as an attribute that sort of builds worlds.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to say something about that, about this thing that language can also do of this destructive capacity that it has.
Well, it's partly a question of morphology. Sentences and words are made up of units, joined together in many subtle ways. The phonetic connections are very, very subtle, the way that one word sort of anticipates another word. We bend our sounds, we widen, we broaden, we narrow our language to accept other words coming in as we're thinking ahead to form the sentence we have in mind. And that's all part of the analysis of language, which is a process of taking apart. So it's a very familiar process to us. You want to know what's done, what's happened, and we take it apart and see where the joins are, and what made it what it is. But at the same time, it's a process of putting things together. And for me, those two processes perhaps run through poetry as well. Wanting to know what stuff is made of, but also, for me, the world is made of language. Physical objects wouldn't exist unless there were cognitive concepts to think about them with.
Yes.
That's the way in which poetry and language generally builds the world for us.
But also distances us.
Yes, yes.
Like Graves's cool web,
To a certain extent, yes. And there's the so-called pathetic fallacy. Don't project your own thoughts and feelings onto the world.
Yes.
But we only look at the world through our heads. We look at the world through a physical screen, which is our bodies. As soon as you open your eyes, you've committed the pathetic fallacy, because there's nothing to see except what your brain and eyes show you. And there is nothing more than that, really. We plaster ourselves over the world as soon as we look at anything or listen and touch the world.
So it's interesting, the mermaid and the man trying to imagine each other's experience.
Yes, yes.
And it's comic and it's also sad, isn't it?
Yes. I was impressed by, I was having holidays in the Dumfries and Galloway area of Scotland. And when I came back, I wrote this poem about the mermaid indoors, and only realized afterwards that there's a strong tradition of mermaid interactions and sightings on the Solway Firth. But these were not the pleasant mermaids of Little Mermaid and childish films and so on, but rather frightening creatures. And I wanted to bring out some of that aspect. I wanted her to be benign, but forged by very, very severe and difficult environment, which must make her an extremely tough creature. And too much to be held in a suburban home.
Yes. It's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Generous answer.
I think Ed had a question behind you, Jacques. You want to go next, Ed? And then I see Douglas's hand after that. Just be unmuted again.
Thank you, Melissa. Basil, thank you. That was a fascinating reading.
Thank you.
Hey, the wry humor and the imagery, just brilliant. I wondered about the connection to philosophy, and wondered, because it's almost as if the imagery, there's something very freeing in the imagery that you use, meaning thought-provoking, meaning the act of poetry. It feels to me like it's a liberating thing for you, and that you can make connections with nuanced arguments, philosophy. So I'm not putting this very well, but I just wondered, I guess, about the appeal of poetry for you, given that your interest in philosophy. And my other question would be your process. Is there anything that it's almost as if I can hear the musicality in your poems. I imagine you spend a lot of time crafting them, and maybe one doesn't need to know someone's process, but I'm intrigued.
Yes. the process of writing, I write poems quickly, normally about 20 minutes. Well, 20 minutes gives me 99% of the poem, and then the other 1% gets written. You need the whole rest of your life to finish off the last 1%. Looking at it again, changing it here, changing it there. So it's hard to characterize it as a time scale.
Mhm.
Philosophy, I never treat philosophy in my poetry in a totally serious way. It's always meant to be slightly subversive, slightly transgressive. And to that extent, philosophy does liberate me to think about things which maybe I oughtn't to think about, or it gives me some cheeky or naughty outlook on life. It's always philosophy, a question of speculation, taking nothing for granted and so on. So the leads that it gives you, you can follow without committing yourself absolutely to the doctrines that are behind it. So I find that a very liberating process.
Mhm. Mm. I love the subversion.
Yes,
Yes.
but behind it all, my basic concept of reality and language in the world comes from my reading in philosophy, especially Immanuel Kant, who I'm reading at the moment. The Critique of Pure Reason, I read between 2 and 3 every morning because my sleep habits have been wrecked. So I'm forced to turn the light on for a couple of hours and I read a bit of Kant. And I've read him so much that he's totally informed my way of seeing the world as being a projection of our states of mind.
Thank you. That's very useful.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Then we've got a question from Douglas.
My philosophy knowledge is speculative at best, with rather random reading. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was Cantor who completely undid the idea entertained by Russell and others that mathematics was underpinned by logic.
Yes.
And that kind of led to a bomb going off in philosophy that's never been repaired since. The wreckage inspected by Wittgenstein at length in 2 completely different phases. And
That's a very nice way. That's a very nice way of putting it, Douglas.
I think that it's an insoluble problem, and much of what I got from my reading of Stevens was the subtle sense throughout his poetry, particularly his later poems, that the act of writing itself, in its effort to embrace the real, or its effort to embrace the world, let's call it, we know actually it's a failed mission before we begin.
Yes.
Perhaps you can just talk around that idea, because part of what I see in your poems, which I really do appreciate, is that sense that one gets from Stevens particularly, but 1 or 2 other writers, of this idea that that it is a failed mission, but in that failure can come a certain efflorescence, a certain beauty that entertains us deeply, and so we have to undertake the mission.
Yes. If you start off with the idea that reality is a sort of something objective and independent out there, and the function of language is to try and get to that reality, like a sort of mission to Mars, and you keep finding that you're never getting there, or if you do get there, you don't know that you are there. That's a very perplexing experience. That's why I like the Kantian idea. That is, if there is anything out there, it's not worth thinking about. Everything that we experience the world of phenomena is given by us. There's already an archway pre-built into our very way of thinking to reality. However, if you think there's something beyond that archway, which it doesn't connect to, then you're in trouble. And I suppose Stevens might have been in that sort of trouble, which is why he thought about it so often and so constantly and kept worrying about it in his poems. But as you said, he took us through so many wonderful places in his passage of trying to get there. But it is astonishing that, you know, so much of his career was based on trying to understand what poetry is, and language and reality. These are abstractions, rather than just simply taking a look at pears, peaches, trees, people, politics. We're told not to write about poetry as a subject, but I find it fairly irresistible, and I'm always writing about it. So he's one of my real champions and heroes. I love Wallace Stevens.
And so do I. There's a remarkable film made by a Spanish director, I can't remember his name at the minute, called The Quince Tree Sun.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about a Spanish painter, Lopez Garcia? He's a Madrid painter. And the whole film is spent showing the painter trying to paint the quince tree in his yard.
Yes.
And each day the leaves are subtly different and the light is subtly different. And yesterday's work has to be amended, and then he has to start again, and so on for weeks on end.
Yes.
It's extraordinarily slow film, but it does capture that essential dilemma that everyone who picks up a pen or paintbrush faces.
Yes.
That in the very act of writing, somehow you're undercutting, or you're undercutting the purpose.
I think that artists are faced very nakedly with that particular problem of what's there and how do you represent it. Because you're using one of the base data of perception, which is sight. All you have to do is record, you would think, what's right in front of your eyes. But in fact, it turns out to be not that easy at all. And the paradoxes of what you see and what you put down and the discrepancy between the two must be pretty discouraging sometimes.
Yeah. I won't carry on.
Thanks very much for the comments and the questions and the very succinct summary of post-Kantorian philosophy.
Educating us all. Anybody else who has a question or comment for Basil? Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Paul.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was going to say I've read many of Baz's poems. What really shone through with the reading was a great sense of humor. So it's just as well we were all on mute, or you would have heard some hysterical laughter, particularly on the second poem about the poems claiming territory. Extremely funny. So I'm very glad for one that Baz does write about poets and poetry. So, and I've just been in a Sint. He mentions Norman McCaig, and so Norman McCaig seems to have claimed a good bit of Edinburgh and most of a Sint for himself. So I'm wondering which parts of the world you allude to some I don't know, scrubby back alleys or something in your poem. I can't quite remember. I'd like to read it again or hear it again. But Baz, which parts or which part or parts of the world do you claim for yourself?
No, I claim that it's just a very anonymous roadside verge of grasses and weeds and so on a road near Glenrothes.
Ah, yes.
That's just a facetious comment. Actually, when I think for themes that inspire me, I think of coastal areas, the interaction between the sea and the land. I suppose, although I've never lived there, I think of some of the coastlines of Natal, the pristine beaches, the warm seas. And I see that as some kind of ideal of existence. And I keep going back to those ambiguous environments, which are full of, for me, fascinating things. So that's where I go. It's not an actual locality, but it's a type of locality. And certainly the Natal one, KwaZulu-Natal one, is one of those.
Have you got any Natal poems?
I have a couple, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I have a couple of poems. Paul has a incredibly productive garden, many acres in extent, which he and his wife spend their entire life virtually, apart from being artists, cultivating and being independent, self-sufficient from this particular garden. And there's so many wonderful things in it. And as a poet, you want to go along and you want to write poems about all these things, the insects and the buds and the flowers and so on. But you can't always achieve what you want to achieve. And the poems I've written about your garden have not been adequate. I've not been able to really say these are ones I'm going to stand by. But I keep trying. I keep trying. I've got quite a few poems about your garden. And so that's obviously one place I visit in my mind as an ideal place. I wouldn't claim it, it's your garden, but it's a place for writing about that I enjoy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for those questions. Anybody else who wants to ask or comment anything? No, doesn't look like it. Basil, any other final comments before we take a break for the open mic? Or anything you want to say about where people can find your work or anything like that?
I don't really have anything to say, no. I suppose my work's in two places, South Africa and Britain. So the South African work is normally in magazines, stanzas and carapace and so on. So I guess it's quite hard to get hold of.
Oh,
but I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be able to have an audience of largely, obviously, wonderfully, not entirely South African listeners. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity. Thank you to Red Wheelbarrow.
Thank you. Douglas has got a hand maybe to say something about stanzas.
No, well, no. It's always a pleasure to get poems from Basil for stanzas. Just to say that at some point in the next, I don't know how long, 2023, if possible, I do hope to bring out a selected work of a selection of Basil's poems under one of the many imprints I seem to generate over time, probably Crane River, I imagine. But to me, what's missing from our communal library of works, and I'm in Cape Town at the moment.
Yes.
What's missing from our communal library of works is a selection of your work published here and available here. I think that's, to me, the various lacunae in the published works that we have here, and yours is one.
Well, the filling of that gap would be an extraordinary welcome thing for me. I would certainly love that, for something to be collected and more easily available to South African readers rather than just
Yep.
scattered about the magazines.
Yep.
So that would be an opportunity I would really welcome extremely highly.
One
So I
of my
look forward to
goals.
working with you on that project.
One of my goals.
Very exciting news indeed. And we've got another hand from,
Hi,
yes.
it's Kelly. I am Basil's sister-in-law, and I'm with Basil's brother. And Colin doesn't want to say anything, but I'd like to say thank you, Basil. It was a real privilege to listen to you read tonight. And please be welcome anytime in KwaZulu-Natal. We have beautiful views of the ocean, and
Yes.
we welcome you anytime.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I appreciate your making the effort and time to come onto the Zoom session and following the reading. Very much appreciated.
Well, we hope to see you soon.
Plans to visit South Africa are sort of continually rolling and on the boil all the time, but various things have intervened. But we do definitely have plans for an extended visit there, and we'd love to see you.
Wonderful, Basil. Thank you for the reading.
Thank you.
Lovely. Maybe your plans will coincide with your book launch. Who knows? Awesome.
God willing.
Yes. God and Douglas willing. So then I think that wraps up the first part. Basil, thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful to hear your work and to offer you the space to share with.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I appreciate all the questions asked. It was great getting that interest and getting my feedback on that in more informal way. Thank you.
Indeed. Smart group. Thank you. So if you want to unmute and clap for Basil, we can do that. And then we'll take a short break before the open mic.
Thank you very much.